Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Just remember one thing, the longer the title, the less important the position. I want to thank the National Council of Resistance of Iran US office, Sunus Sami and Ali Riza and your colleagues and interns for inviting me here today. I want to welcome the Organization of Iranian American Communities, the OIAC, which is the one and only legitimate voice of the Iranian American community. Maybe the press should know that. The Congress does. If our remarks are reaching beyond Washington, we want to say hello to Madame Rajavi and the NCRI and the team in France and Paris, around Europe, the brave men and women of the MEK at Ashraf III in Albania, the brave Iranian people and the NCRI supporters inside Iran who are struggling for freedom, the diaspora all around the world, and their friends and supporters who are growing in number all the time. We heard many things at the amazing rally in Brussels yesterday. You've heard many of them. I just want to focus on one of them. Former Vice President Mike Pence, who said he spoke about an independent movement that clearly, from where I stand and as the world watches, is now bigger and stronger and more inspired and powerful than ever before, an unstoppable movement for freedom called the MEK. That's what he said. I found that very striking. It was just a dozen years ago that Professor Sheehan and I were working at the University of Baltimore to publish a publication of mine, and the name MEK was so forbidden in Washington. There was a reputation issue if you mentioned MEK inside the Washington Beltway, so that we put the letters in big, bright red letters, MEK, as a way of saying, we're not afraid of this name anymore. Well, today, the Vice President of the United States standing in Brussels before tens of thousands of people, beating his breast about the MEK is a big change. 5 years later, Professor Sheehan and I collaborated on another publication where we talked at length about the life and the work of Masoud Rajavi, who came from a very distinguished family of highly educated people, surgeons and engineers, people who studied law in Paris and in Geneva. This is someone who, of course, was demeaned as being a terrorist and et cetera. I'm going to take a few minutes today, if you don't mind, and just talk a little bit about the 60 years that began with the three people you see there. Next slide, please. And I know that we talk about Mohammad Hanif Nejad, Saeed Mohsen, and Ali Asghar Badizadegan. There are many others who were part of this movement, including Masoud Rajavi and their supporters. This was not a military group. This was a movement. They attracted supporters. They didn't know all the people who knew them. What they did, quietly at first, was to talk about what Iran should be. They had seen the overthrow of Mossadegh. They were supporters of Mossadegh. They supported the freedom movement, Mehdi Bazargan, and they were looking at the world around them, where countries had escaped from colonialism and superpower influence in Cuba, in Algeria, in Vietnam. These were inspirations to them. And so they studied change. They read many of the political development philosophers, as I did as a college student at Harvard. They read Karl Marx on the subject of inequality and how this could put a strain on society, as I did at Harvard. And so as the 60s went on, we've heard the demonization that the MEK was some secret violent movement. The Shah's secret police didn't know anything about them for 6 entire years. This was an intellectual study group. This was not a terrorist movement. Now, as the 60s went on, there were protests all over America. My father was a professor. There were sit-ins at MIT, the Students for Democratic Society, the Berrigan Brothers, the Chicago, the Black Panthers. This was happening in Europe. It was all over the world. It was happening in Iran. And the students were inspired. There were also radical leftists. They weren't all Muslim intellectuals. There were fedayeen. There were people who went to East Germany and Cuba and who went to see the Palestinian terror groups. And so it was a very diverse movement that was against colonial influence, superpower influence against the Shah. And it wasn't all MEK. To give you an idea of what really happened when they were arrested, they saw that the Fedayeen were setting off bombs. They were creating incidents to embarrass the Shah. Let me read for you just a quote from Ervan Abrahamian's book, The Iranian Mujahideen. This is someone who signed petitions that made clear he was not a supporter of the group, but he did a lot of work to study the MEK's history. The Fedayeen were not Muslims. They were not the MEK. They were setting off bombs. They exploded 8 bombs to protest the visit to Iran of Richard Nixon. But after they were arrested, let me talk about why they were arrested. They wanted to embarrass the Shah during his 2,500-year celebration of the peacock throne. So they thought, what if we could knock the power out? And so to prove that they were not a terrorist group, they didn't have any ability to do this. So they went out in search of some kind of explosive, and they talked to someone who turned out to be an informant for the Shah. And that's why they were arrested. And soon enough, many of them were imprisoned, sentenced to death, and put to death. In fact, a number of these brave young people, 20, 21, 22 years old, wrote their final remarks and smuggled them out of prison before they were put to death. And these speeches created a sensation. I've talked to supporters in the United States who saw these speeches when they were studying in America, and it inspired them greatly. So it became a brand. The Mujahideen became a very important name among young people, that they represented the future. They represented the hope of Iran. But what did the MEK do? What Abrahamian says in 1972, mind you, they had already been arrested, they're in jail. These people are not on the street. So there were Mujahideen setting off some explosions late at night. And what he said was they would usually call in advance to warn people, set them off late at night, and he concludes that none of these incidents were considered worth mentioning by the American press. This is 60 years ago, 50 years ago. So interesting that as I studied the terrorism reports in the State Department from recent years, they were dragging up this kind of incident, which is vandalism, yes, politically motivated. I'm not justifying it, but I am putting it in some perspective here. And these may well have been leftists. They may well have been secularists. They may well have been opponents of what was left of the MEK. So we need to be clear that there was a very chaotic situation, and the Shah, of course, wanted everyone to be afraid of anyone related to Mujahideen, so he demonized them. He called them Marxists. He was the one that did this. Very clever. So these were idealistic intellectuals who wanted change, and they were competing for prestige. Now, they claimed that when Americans were killed during the 1970s in Tehran, it's the Mujahideen. That's what they said. Well, all right, but you know that all of these people were not there anymore. Next slide, please. We know who the killers were. They were caught. We had press there. We know their names. We know where they came from. They had nothing to do with Masoud Rajavi. We now know definitively that no one in what we consider the MEK, PMOI, NCRI had anything to do with the killing of Americans in the 1970s. But back then, it was part of the Shah's strategy to demonize them and to make everyone afraid of them. And so this is why this was his attempt. But in fact, the extremists were against Masoud Rajavi's MEK. And they modified the name. They wanted to use a flag that looked a little bit like this, Mujahideen Marxist-Leninist. It wasn't the same MEK. Next slide. They even clashed in the 1970s with the MEK. In May 1975, there was an MEK supporter. Majid Sharif Vakifi was killed by secular Mujahideen with a different part. After Khomeini came in and before he split with Masoud Rajavi, which we'll talk about, they renamed it in the honor of this MEK member, Sharif University, because he had died to defend Islam against the secularists. I think this is important for people to understand, the confusion that was created by the Shah. And so we now know that Ar-Yamer University is now Sharif University. Le Monde in 1980-81 said that Masoud Rajavi's lectures at Tehran University would gather 10,000 students on the lawn to hear him speak for 3 hours about political philosophy, about political change. He was a true intellectual who had, obviously, passion for the future of Iran. I know many people in Washington who are in the intelligence community, who are in the diplomatic community. They teach college classes. They go to Georgetown or George Mason or others. When have they ever had 10,000 people lining up to hear their remarks? This is pretty extraordinary. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted the support of Masoud Rajavi. His distinguished brother, Kazem Rajavi, was made ambassador of Iran to the UN agencies in Geneva. So they had this meeting in mid-1979. Next slide, please. Masoud Rajavi came with his deputy, and they met with Khomeini, Musa Kiabani on the left. They had a meeting, and I spoke to someone who I believe was in the room. Of course, the US had no diplomats then. This was after the hostage crisis. So I tried to write about it in my 2013 account of the history of the MEK. And Khomeini said, look, the Muslims follow you. They like you. We want your support for the new constitution, the one that he never told anyone about when he was in Paris. Only when he arrived did we realize he was making himself the embodiment of the 12th Imam of the Prophet, who was in occultation. He had a divine mandate which superseded anything that a government could decide. He was the supreme leader. And this was a dictatorship. Masoud Rajavi said, I cannot support this. The Iranian people have just overthrown a dictatorship, a monarchical dictatorship. They will not accept a clerical dictatorship. And Khomeini, according to an eyewitness, turned cold, never said another word, and soon afterwards allegedly hand-wrote a fatwa condemning Rajavi and his supporters to death, which they have been carrying out every day for the last 46 years, trying to find and kill the MEK. I don't think that is an overstatement, and neither do you. So after that, there was a presidential election. As Ali Riza's charts show so well, it was by far the most, if you will, participatory election. Almost everyone who wanted to run was on the ballot except one man, Masoud Rajavi, who would have gained, according to Le Monde, millions of votes. Not just women, intellectuals, students, ethnic minorities, regular Iranians. He stood for the rights of all Iranians. He might well, if he had been politically selfish, he might well have been Iran's first elected president under the mullahs, if that's the route he wanted to take. But he stood on principle, said no, and a reign of terror ensued, as you have heard. So in Le Monde in 1980, Masoud Rajavi said, quote, freedom is the essence of evolution and the principal message of Islam and revolution, freedom. That's not what Khomeini was saying at all. You can see the difference was about Islam. And of course, Khomeini was aghast that someone was challenging. He's trying to be supreme leader. He's saying we're going to have a Shia kingdom that goes through Iraq, the holy cities, all the way to Jerusalem, to Quds. And here's Masoud Rajavi saying Islam means freedom. He's disagreeing with the clerics on their interpretation of Islam. So this turned into a very bloody struggle. Masoud Rajavi spoke of the necessity of, quote, guaranteeing freedom for all parties, opinions, and writings. We do not accept anything less in the name of Islam. Freedom for all parties, opinions, and writings. The exact opposite of what the clerics have done with their power. And so tensions rose, and on June 20, 1981, a fateful day in the history of the country, some historians will eventually know this, 500,000 people in the streets of Tehran. The regime opened fire. They saw they were about to be swept away, just like the Shah, and they shot their way to power. President Bani Sadr was violently impeached. His three closest allies were murdered. His newspaper facilities were attacked. A reign of terror ensued. Rajavi and Bani Sadr were secretly flown out of Iran to Paris. The regime arrested, imprisoned, and killed men and women, including children, for helping the PMOI in the tens of thousands during the 1980s. In February 1982, you saw the picture of Musa Kiabani. He was with Masoud Rajavi's wife, Ashraf, and their baby, Mustafa. They were shot in the streets of Tehran that day, and that night the regime held up the infant who was still alive over the body of his dead mother, Ashraf, on national television. That's what we're talking about. That's the regime that Americans and other ministries of other countries have tried to reason with all these years. And so, much like the Shah, Khomeini's media operation did their best to poison the name of the MEK with the Iranian people. They couldn't afford to have his medieval vision of Islam called into question. So they called Rajavi, picked up on the Shah's media message and called them Marxist. Even though the MEK were not Marxist, never in history has the MEK had an office in a communist country. And yet, talk about hypocrites, another name that was appropriated by the regime against the MEK, this is the ultimate hypocrisy. The regime invited in KGB specialists because they couldn't maintain control of the population. The people were restive. They didn't like dictatorship. So they brought in the KGB to advise Khomeini and his regime. Despite executing, we now know, tens of thousands of MEK members and supporters starting in 1981, and it was about religion, and it was finally called genocide last year by the UN Special Rapporteur, Javid Rahman. Masoud Rajavi did not abandon his principles. A few years later in Paris, he said, quote, "The Islam we profess does not condone bloodshed. We have never sought, nor do we welcome confrontation and violence." Yes, there was armed struggle against the regime from 1981 to 2001. Now, here in Washington, some political leaders understood what Masoud Rajavi and his followers had actually gone through and the cause he was leading. There were people who knew that he was a legitimate champion of human rights and democracy. Sent letters from John McCain when he was a congressman, Ted Kennedy, President-elect Bill Clinton, "Dear Masoud," to his address in Paris. This wasn't just a form letter sent by his staff. These were acknowledgments that he was not a toxic personality. Masoud Rajavi was not in question at that time. Most people in American think tanks and academia don't even realize that the toxic descriptions of the MEK only began to appear in Washington more than a decade after the revolution, long after the killings of the Americans, the embassy seizure, and the hostage crisis. In the immediate aftermath, the Americans did not view the MEK as guilty of any of these things because they were not. But eventually, with relentless pressure from Tehran and its propaganda operation, our nation's capital, Washington, adopted the regime's narrative that the MEK was a violent, Marxist, terrorist cult. This page one photo is a little unclear. It shows an F-4 jet shot down over Camp Ashraf in Iraq by the MEK after the Tehran regime violated the Iran-Iraq ceasefire and sent fighter jets to bomb Camp Ashraf. They claimed on the radio that Masoud and Maryam Rajavi had been killed. Of course, not true. But no one knew that. None of you knew that. Their supporters around the world reacted with extreme anger, and they attacked embassies and consulates, just as you would if someone had taken something from you that was so special. Years later, our State Department called this a coordinated global terrorist operation by the MEK, as if it had been planned, centrally operated by a terrorist organization. It was nothing of the sort. Nowhere was any protester prosecuted for terrorism. But this is the kind of propaganda we've been up against. Unfortunately, many reputable institutions and media organizations fell victim to false information from the regime. You see these brand names. These are very highly respected brands. You trust what they tell you. And most of the time, you can. But these people have all, I would say, been fooled by the regime. It reinforced the common belief in Washington, hearing them say that the MEK was a terrorist group, that the defamatory allegations were true. In Iraq, where the MEK resided for 30 years, from 1986 to 2016, US policymakers were more interested in finding a way to have better relations with Tehran than in understanding the dirty war that Tehran was fighting against the MEK in the United States. In the lead up to the 2003 Iraq intervention, at a meeting in Geneva, Iran asked US envoys for an assurance. They asked twice that the MEK would be treated as an enemy in that operation. US diplomats gave that assurance. They said yes. A bombing operation was conducted. Mrs. Rajavi told me that 50 or more were killed by the US bombing. I spoke with the US Air Component Commander, who became Chief of the US Air Force, a personal friend, and he remembered being told to drop some bombs on a certain set of coordinates north of Baghdad. In truth, the MEK had announced their neutrality, and they gave the US their location. They were not belligerents in the 2003 Iraq intervention. As the State Department later said, they never fired a shot at anyone. They contacted US forces in 2003 and voluntarily gave up all their weapons to US forces. The US had an interagency intelligence team that interviewed every member of the MEK in Iraq, every one of them. Not one had committed any terrorism, crimes, or actions against the US. Each MEK member was given a protected person's identity card by the United States of America. A RAND Corporation report misstated these facts and misinterpreted international law, going so far as to recommend turning all the MEK members over to the Iran regime. If you can imagine that. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki of Iraq had a history of working closely with the regime in Tehran. He coordinated with Quds Force Commander, General Soleimani, to stage 7 lethal attacks on the MEK men and women, as you have heard, killing 140 and wounding well over 1,000. Responding to Maliki's demand, which reflected Tehran's agenda, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said she would not consider taking the MEK off the list of terrorist states unless they moved out of Camp Ashraf to another location, which was a very cramped, dangerous site at Baghdad airport under the guns of Maliki's army. Why? Because she believed the propaganda story, amplified by a Human Rights Watch report, which interviewed a number of people by telephone who were clearly under the control of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. And so she believed that MEK members were being held against their will in Camp Ashraf and could not speak freely. Therefore, they had to be moved. The number 2 UN official in Iraq was a London-educated human rights lawyer from Algeria, Tahar Boumedra. He had experienced detention with his family as a child in Algeria. Mr. Boumedra witnessed Prime Minister Maliki's coordination with Iran. He saw his boss, the head of the UN mission, UNAMI, whose wife was his country's ambassador to Iraq, go along with actions that violated UN principles, sending misleading reports to the UN Secretariat in New York and to the NCRI in Paris. Secretary Clinton and the US Embassy in Baghdad apparently had no idea that at least 5 meetings with the UNAMI mission and Iraqi officials to coordinate the relocation of the MEK to Camp Liberty in Baghdad were held in the Iran Embassy in Baghdad. Tahar Boumedra resigned from the UN in protest. He left behind some pay that was due to him. I invited him to Washington, where he wrote an op-ed in The Hill, and he was invited to testify before a House committee. The UN Secretariat tried to suppress his story and deny his version of events, but Tahar Boumedra had all of the documentation and published it in a book. Even then, Washington did not want to believe it. So when the National Council of Resistance of Iran held events like this one in Paris in 2011, pardon my photography, 30 years after the reign of terror began, the reaction of Washington's Iran watchers, including the State Department, was one of denial. They would look at this and say, the NCRI and the MEK have no relevance to the future of Iran. Sound familiar? The notable speakers only came to Paris because they were paid. The large audience must have been bussed in from Eastern Europe for the day, given a stipend and a free sandwich. Where does all the money come from? We've heard this so many times. Slowly and surely, the truth has come out. Even in 2011, there were indications that something was amiss with these defamatory stories about the MEK. Just 2 months before that June gathering in Paris, concluding an 8-year investigation, French magistrate Marc Trevedic said, quote, "The dossier does not contain any evidence indicating an armed activity that would intentionally target civilians," the definition of terrorism. Hence, the group's armed activity from 1981 to 2001 is judged to be, quote, "resistance against tyranny," unquote. This was reinforced in 3 major court cases: the European Union, the UK, where the Superior Court had to overrule the lower courts and the Foreign Ministry, and the United States, where Secretary of State Hillary Clinton faced a deadline imposed by the Court of Appeals. Make a decision. Are they terrorists or not? And she turned to her experts one last time, by an account that I've heard, and there was no evidence. Her quote was, "I will not be embarrassed by the court. Take them off the list." So I give her credit for doing the right thing. Over a dozen years later, we now know much more. We know that the Shah and the clerical regime engaged in unspeakable brutality to suppress political dissent. We've learned about the atrocity crimes of tens of thousands of executions throughout the 1980s, and of course, the 1988 massacre of up to 30,000 political prisoners. We've seen how the regime works through terrorist proxy militias and criminal gangs, planning terror attacks, murders, abductions, bombings, cyber attacks, and hostage takings throughout the Middle East, Europe, North America, South America, even Australia. The world has realized that Tehran's version of history was a lie. Tehran's propaganda campaign has been exposed, including dozens of movies and television series, hundreds of books, tens of thousands of articles, all of them against the MEK and NCRI. Tehran's network of agents of influence has been exposed, thanks to the research and writings of Professor Sheehan, among others. Now, when we see a huge response to Iran's organized resistance, such as yesterday in Brussels, with a huge audience, by the way, watching online, no one's asking where the money's coming from. No one's claiming that the crowd wasn't filled with authentic supporters. No one is saying that the MEK and the NCRI lack any relevance to the future of Iran. To the contrary, in the past few years, the clerics in Tehran can't stop complaining about all the support the organized resistance has gained with the Iranian people. And suddenly, we see a new face popping up on social media. The son of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, is actively promoting himself as someone who could replace the Ayatollahs in power. All I can say is look at the NCRI's Brussels rally yesterday, and then consider, no one ever asks where the Shah's son gets his money. Everyone knows that the Pahlavi family took a fortune with them when they fled the country. And here's a question for Mr. Pahlavi that no one asks about the NCRI. Where are the crowds? Other than remnants of Savak and a few exiles, sentimental for those days when they enjoyed a life of colonial privilege, you won't find crowds or any notable political people advocating a return to monarchy. You don't hear any complaints from the regime about Reza Pahlavi either. Clearly, they do not take him seriously, and neither should you. If anything, the clerics welcome Reza Pahlavi's clickbait campaign as a distraction from the change that the Iranian people are demanding together with the organized resistance. Outside Iran, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan for the future of Iran, which she has advocated for 19 years consistently, has been endorsed by 137 former heads of government, 80 Nobel laureates, and majorities in 34 national parliaments, including a bipartisan majority in the US House of Representatives. That's over 4,000 elected legislators. Change is coming to Iran. The regime has failed. The Iranian people are demanding an end to religious fascism. And today, we mark the 60-year anniversary of the MEK and salute all the Iranians inside the country, at Ashraf III in Albania, in Paris with the NCRI, and throughout the worldwide diaspora. I remember I told you how young these people were who were sentenced to death by the Shah. I'm going to quote from Nasser Sadek, who may have been 22 years old, I don't know, a young man. Before being put to death, he said this, quote, "You have tortured us, convicted us in your kangaroo courts, and now you are about to sign our death warrants. Have you ever stopped to think why so many young intellectuals like us are willing to join the armed struggle, spend their whole lives in prison, and if necessary, shed their blood? Have you ever asked yourself why so many of us are willing to make the supreme sacrifice," unquote. More and more people of conscience, ladies and gentlemen, are now asking themselves that question. And as we consider the incredible sacrifice and bravery shown by our Iranian friends every day, we know that the quest for popular sovereignty, for human rights and dignity, for gender equality, for a just and virtuous society, worthy of the great Persian culture, the idea begun by Messrs. Hanif-Nejad, Barizadeh and Mohsen, is finally going to prevail. To my colleagues and fellow citizens in Washington and around the US, I ask that you look past the propaganda and false hopes and realize there's no bargain to be struck with the criminal dictatorship in Iran. Their time is up. Join us in standing for a third way. No to war, no to appeasement, yes to regime change from within by the Iranian people and their organized resistance. Mrs. Rajavi said yesterday in Brussels, I quote, "Uprising and overthrow are on the way," unquote. Let us stand for truth, stand for principle, stand for justice. And when we do, the world will become a better place, welcoming the shining new presence of a free Iran. Thank you.